Please don't let me fall. Those were the very last words of Mary Surratt.
Welcome back to the O'Toole 101 podcast, and today we'll be talking about Mary Surratt.
Mary Surratt was 42 years old when she was taken from her home and workplace, a boarding house in Washington, D.C., to the Old Arsenal Penitentiary. Little did Surratt know that when she arrived at the penitentiary, she would never leave. That is, she would never leave alive. That morning, though, that is, the morning of April 17, 1865, Surratt was arrested by Captain Henry Warren Smith and other members of the U.S. War Department. She, a middle-aged boarding house owner, would be held for about a month at the penitentiary under the supervision of military officials, would be tried in a military tribunal, and would be executed by U.S. military personnel. Why was this sort of treatment necessary? The answer is that it wasn't.
I couldn't agree more. To go even deeper, though, how did Surratt's gender influence public opinion and media portrayals of her at the time?
Good question, Rudy. And I think that's important to ask considering that Mary Surratt's case barely made headlines. Fear, timing, and a biased press buried her story before her fate could even be decided. Lincoln's assassination spread emotions like wildfire across the country. Southerners were afraid that the Northerners would come for vengeance, and the Northerners were angry that Southern radicals had killed their beloved president. Most editors portrayed Surratt as having had a fair trial and as being an unpatriotic citizen. After the Civil War, the federal government restricted constitutional liberties from 1861 to 1865, including freedom of speech and press. Therefore, any anti-union press was considered dangerous due to the political and military situation. During this time period, many newspapers were highly partisan, meaning they released press in favor of the government stance, siding with them. They often portrayed Surratt negatively, defending her as guilty before and even after execution. So now I'm kind of curious, Rudy. Given who Mary Surratt was, how did a trial reflect 19th century expectations of women and morality?
Many argued that gender should have spared her from execution, as no woman had been federally executed in the U.S. before.
Wait, but why was gender a factor in the trial?
Well, women were seen as moral caretakers, making execution seem extreme. Her punishment challenged typical 19th century norms, and her conviction highlighted rigid societal expectations, since women were perceived as virtuous, not criminals. Her perceived betrayal of this moral standard likely influenced public opinion.
In your opinion, how did people react to execution?
Well, some believed it was wartime vengeance rather than justice, while others saw it as proof that women could face severe consequences for stepping outside traditional roles and that they were capable of evil. Her trial illuminated the era's strict notions of female virtue and morality.
But what were these notions?
Well, women were expected to embody purity and domestic roles like staying at home, cooking, cleaning, and taking care of kids. Any deviation, especially involvement in crime, was harshly judged and looked down upon. Some viewed her execution as unjust, arguing the evidence was weak, or others saw it as necessary enforcement of law, regardless of her gender.
Did her case ever impact how women were treated in the legal system?
Yes, it actually set a precedent that women could be held accountable for crimes just like men, reinforcing the idea that the legal system wouldn't make exceptions based on gender like it does today. Ultimately, Mary Surratt remains a controversial figure, standing at the intersection of gender, law, and national tragedy in the United States.
Surratt became the very first woman to be executed by the U.S. federal government. She'd hosted John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt Jr., her son, at her boarding house, but there was little evidence that she herself was conspiring against Lincoln. George Surratt and Lewis Powell also contributed to the assassination of Lincoln on April 14th, and both were hosted by Surratt. Instead of being tried in a civilian court, Surratt was treated roughly, and she was brought to a military tribunal in the Old Arsenal Penitentiary. She was found guilty. On July 7, 1865, she was executed by hanging alongside Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Surratt. Just by looking at the execution photo, though, it's obvious from afar that one of the so-called criminals is not like the others. Surratt's dress hangs in the wind. Surprisingly, though, she didn't leave very much of a mark on history. There are barely any records even today of her execution in detail. There's no record of an execution bell being rung out of respect for the procedure prior to her last breath. Surratt did fall that day, but what's more, she never got her bell. Surratt may have co-conspired against Abraham Lincoln, but she did not receive a fair trial. So, for Mary Surratt, we will now have a moment of silence as we ring the bell she never received, the bell that only men had the honor of receiving before her conviction.
Thank you, Audrey Cho, for the music, Rudy Jolly for the editing, and Hayden Wan for the research of this podcast.